Good evening, Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Talking Point. This episode you'll be able to find on our YouTube channel, which is Hilaal TV. Now, of course, with the ceasefire that is currently on the go between Iran and Israel, questions have come about with regards to what the last 12 days would have taken in terms of the global market, the potential impact on energy and maritime security, particularly on oil and gas flows through the crucial Strait of Hormus and the choke point there. Joining me now to discuss this, I'd like to welcome, he's no stranger to Hilaal TV, Dr. Ruediger Theiselmann, who is the editor of Board Journal, lawyer and a board advisor, and is also a long-time participant of the World Economic Forum in Davos. Dr. Theiselmann, always a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Patel. Good to see you.
No, absolute pleasure. I think we have to start off, of course, with one aspect, Dr. Theiselmann, a very important one. When, of course, this conflict broke out, we saw oil pricing shoot to quite a extraordinary level. Of course, it never rose to the level that we saw when the Ukraine-Russia war had started. But the importance of that Strait of Hormuz, how important is it in terms of the flow of oil and gas?
Well, the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most critical choke points for global oil trade, with about 20% of global oil passing through it. Any instability in this region, any geopolitical tension involving Iran, particularly if it escalates into conflict, could disrupt the free passage of oil tankers. This typically leads to immediate spikes in global oil prices, increased market volatility, and a reshuffling of energy sourcing strategies by oil importing nations. If Iran, which is now a BRICS member, gains more leverage or faces intensified military or diplomatic pressure, the global energy market will respond swiftly, often with rising prices and strategic reserve releases by the West.
Dr. Theiselmann, I mean, you mentioned about BRICS. Of course, Iran is right now part of the BRICS nation. Foreign investment withdrawal. I mean, that's been the discussion right now. But the thing about Iran is they can bank on nations like, for example, China and Russia, who first came out and were quite vociferous in their condemnation of Israel. But when it came to Iran, there really was a supposed partnership, quote unquote. Never really admitted it, but the fact that you've got Iran, China and Russia as part of BRICS, even though there could have been foreign investment withdrawal from Iran, you still have that strength that is coming from two of the biggest partners within the BRICS nations.
Yeah, in Iran's inclusion in BRICS potentially opens the door to alternative trade and investment opportunities outside of the Western financial sphere. However, Western investors remain highly risk-averse regarding Iran due to the existing sanctions and political instability there. Many multinational corporates, especially from Europe, have already exited Iran due to sanctions. While BRICS affiliation may shield Iran from total financial isolation, it is, from my perspective, unlikely to reverse the overall trend of foreign investment withdrawal from the country, especially from Europe and North America. Non-Western investors, particularly from China and Russia, may fill the gap, but on different terms. For the time being, international investors will likely remain reluctant due to the high risk, poor business environment, and continued legal complications and uncertainty under the US-led sanctions.
Yeah, on sanctions, Dr. Theiselmann, of course, Iran has gone under the sanctions under the current regime of the Ayatollah Khomeini. Of course, the relations with the European Union. Here's the thing, Dr. Theiselmann, the European Union was looking to go ahead and conduct talks with Iran, especially when it came to its nuclear program. Of course, you are in Frankfurt, Germany at this moment. What's the discussions like with the European Union, given what has happened in the past 12 days?
Now that the ceasefire between Israel and Iran has been arranged by the US and Qatar, diplomatic efforts are very likely in the near future. Both Israel and Iran have signaled their willingness to negotiate. The European Union has also called on both sides to engage in diplomacy. For the time being, US sanctions will remain in place, which means, in terms of your question, that sanctions will further strain Iran's already fragile relations with the European Union. With nuclear negotiations stalled, the US and the European Union are likely to continue a sanction-based containment policy until further notice. The European Union, however, may seek, and that's what we have seen over the last decades, a more pragmatic approach to prevent total collapse of diplomatic channels, especially in light of Europe's energy needs and also regional security concerns. But overall, political and economic engagement will remain minimal unless there is a significant shift in Iran's behavior or leadership.
Dr. Theiselmann, I want to touch on US support for Israel. There seems to be this paradox between Netanyahu and Trump. I mean, you had, of course, the US military attacking nuclear facilities in Iran. Just yesterday, we saw Trump saying that he's quite upset with Israel for going ahead in what he termed violating the ceasefire. Here's the thing. America at this moment domestically is going through a lot. Of course, they have domestic issues there, especially from an economic perspective. Do you feel America will suffer domestically, economically, should the support continue? Let's just say the ceasefire doesn't hold out and America is, I wouldn't say obligated, but called upon by Israel to go ahead and assist them in relaunching this war with Iran. From an economic perspective, where does America sit in terms of that?
Well, US President Donald Trump has asserted that recent US strikes on Iran's Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan nuclear enrichment sites were limited in scope and intended to be contained. Despite these assurances, US military forces across the Middle East remain on high alert amid warnings of potential attacks by Iran. Trump has communicated to Tehran that any direct aggression will be met with additional American military responses. However, caution is emerging from within Trump's own administration. Vice President J.D. Vance, for instance, and other senior officials have expressed concern that even a limited military engagement could spiral into a broader long-term conflict if Iran chooses to retaliate. For now, Trump appears to be navigating a precarious path, so authorizing targeted strikes while attempting to avoid the ignition of a wider war. The paradox between Netanyahu's government and Trump's approach could create challenges. If US support for Israel continues without addressing broader regional issues, this might lead to a greater international criticism and strain US relations with other Middle Eastern countries. Domestically, coming back to your question, this support could spark debates in the US about its foreign policy priorities, potentially leading to a divided political landscape. Economic effects will largely depend on secondary impacts, such as defense spending or trade disruptions. While the direct economic burden may be manageable, the long-term geopolitical cost could translate into economic repercussions.
Dr. Theiselmann, I'm sure when you woke up on June the 13th, the first thing you're checking is, of course, global markets, because it's been a whirlwind in terms of what had happened. I mean, in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange in South Africa, markets were. There was inconsistency with regards to that. Nobody really knew what was going to happen. Of course, the big discussion was with regards to what would happen in the oil market. Talk to us about what had happened in Europe and why Europe had been keeping such a keen eye on this conflict, given that within the continent itself, economically, there's also so many challenges that are going on there.
European markets have reacted strongly to geopolitical instability, fluctuating energy prices, and also concerns over further conflict in the Middle East. Investor sentiment has turned cautious, with capital flows moving toward safe haven assets like gold. Volatility in European stock indices, particularly in sectors like energy, defense, and industrials, reflects broader uncertainty about the global economic outlook. Markets may stabilize if tensions de-escalate now in light of the ceasefire, but persistent instability in the Middle East could trigger a prolonged correction or even recession in vulnerable economies.
Dr. Theiselmann, food and commodity prices, there was, of course, this fear that it was going to spike. Now, I want to take you back to, of course, 2022, when the Russia-Ukraine war had started. Wheat, for example, and grain had spiked up. Of course, the price of flour, the price of oil, cooking oil had, of course, spiked up at the time. There were fears that this was going to happen. How important was it that, of course, we got the ceasefire in place, but what impact would the food market have been, especially given that Iran is quite a great exporter in terms of the food market? I mean, it would have been catastrophic, wouldn't it, given that the fact that they export quite a lot, especially within the fruit and vegetable sector. I mean, I was reading something when it came to Pakistan that, of course, they were a big exporter of oranges and citrus to Pakistan. So one could only imagine that if Pakistan were going through a difficult time, the rest of the world, especially Europe and the Middle East, would have suffered a very similar fate.
Well, Mr. Patel, Iran's agricultural and commodity exports, in particular to the Middle East and parts of Asia, are significant. However, sanctions and also banking restrictions have limited its trade with Europe. If BRICS integration now allows Iran to bypass some of these constraints, its food and commodity exports may increase regionally. For Europe, the impact is less direct, but could be felt in pricing and supply chain competition. In the Middle East, in particular in Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria, Iranian exports may provide short-term relief and inflationary pressures, but geopolitical risk remains a bottleneck indeed.
Dr. Theiselmann, I want to go to nuclear energy. I mean, what we've seen in the last 12 days has raised a lot of concerns of, whether nuclear energy can still be trusted. The world wants to move to a green energy. Maybe Donald Trump doesn't think so because he still wants to maintain fossil fuels as supposedly the way energy needs to be conducted within the USA. Of course, the nuclear watchdogs are keeping a close eye on Iran at this very moment. But I just want to get your view on whether the world can still trust nuclear energy given what has happened in the last 12 days.
Mr. Patel, let me phrase it like this. Nuclear energy remains controversial but vital. While the world is shifting towards renewable energies, nuclear provides stable baseload power without carbon emissions. However, safety concerns, nuclear proliferation risk, i.e. that countries with nuclear weapons or nuclear power are able to deliver to countries that don't have nuclear power and nuclear weapons, and also long-term waste disposal issues continue to provoke public skepticism, in particular in the wake of geopolitical tensions involving nuclear-capable states. At the same time, many countries such as France, China, also India, are reinvesting in nuclear power against the backdrop of climate targets and energy security. I hear from suppliers to the nuclear power industry that order intake is currently very strong. However, it will likely face stiff competition from renewable sources that are seen as safer and more sustainable in the long run. Its role may be particularly significant in countries struggling to meet energy demands without relying on fossil fuels.
Dr. Theiselmann, as we speak right now, NATO is meeting. It's going to be interesting how this is going to be conducted, of course, on the back of the ceasefire between Iran and Israel at this moment. I just want to get your view from an economic standpoint. How does NATO approach what has happened in this last 12 days, more particularly on energy future, but most importantly that of agriculture and other aspects of keeping the European economy going, and of course that of NATO in itself?
Mr. Patel, from my perspective, and that's what we hear from well-informed sources, the NATO is calling for diplomacy at present, which then means that all parties involved need to sit down, need to sit down at the table and negotiate. And I mean, we have seen over the last few weeks that this is based on pressure. So this has caused quite a stir. But we'll see over the next couple of weeks that these diplomatic efforts will have success. That's my core belief.
Dr. Theiselmann, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for the exchange.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. That's Dr. Ruediger Theiselmann, editor of Board Journal, lawyer and board advisor, and is also a long-time participant of the World Economic Forum in Davos. Well, that's all we have for you here on Talking Point. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Hilaal TV, for more content like what you've seen right here. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.